Good morning, everybody. After the second day, very intensive day of the BlueMed meeting, we start with the third and last day. And to begin the session, we have a keynote speech from Dr. Grammenos Mastrojeni, Senior Deputy Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean. And the talk is on a climate of peace for the Mediterranean. The reason we asked Dr. Mastrojeni to contribute to our talk, to our meeting, is that BlueMed did not have a particular focus on the socio-economical aspects that climate change is going to project on the Mediterranean as a whole. And Dr. Mastrojeni, among many publications, wrote a book on the relation between climate and wars. And so we thought that it could complement the lines of reasoning that we had and that we proposed yesterday with this very important view in a basin that is fragmented in 22 countries and 3 continents and under major stress already and in the future decades due to the fact that we are in a hotspot of climate change. So I give the floor to Dr. Mastrojeni for his speech. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, dear colleagues. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
The microphone?
The microphone should be on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, dear colleagues, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to address a crucial question, which is putting together all the elements why we should really make a huge effort to defend the Mediterranean. Reasons that go beyond a collection of projected impacts of an unsustainable economy or society. Of course, and I have a problem sending the slide. Okay, of course, you have mentioned this report that has been sponsored by the Union for the Mediterranean, my organization, together with Diplomat and BlueMed. This quite unique report, drawing from the researchers of more than 800 scientists and 80 drafters, appears as a collection of quite disquieting projections about impacts on the Mediterranean, water scarcity, with a forecasted amount of almost 250 million people in water scarcity in a rather short term, more extreme events of all kinds, biodiversity loss both on emerged lands and especially inside the sea, a particularly threatening projection of sea level rise up to 1 meter before the end of the century, but it could be 20-25 centimeters very soon, which is normally not understood as a threat by the common people. 20 centimeters is not a figure that makes people afraid, but only if we forget that it is not a question of water submerging cities like our precious Venice. It is more a problem of salty water entering coastal lands where most of the agriculture is located. And if we take, for instance, the case of the Nile Delta, 20 to 25 centimeters sea level rise means that it will be salinized and thus jeopardize the agriculture of a country that has more than almost 100 million inhabitants. Worrying as they are, if we just take all these predictions along the 550 pages of the report, we only get a collection of impacts, but not the general picture. What is at stake is something which is much, much deeper and much more important. But to understand it, we really have to go a long way before our times. I'm showing you a map that somehow singles out Europe. And if you look at it, maybe you consider that the idea of Europe is kind of unusual. if we apply the criteria through which all other continents have been singled out, Europe simply should not exist. We are a small piece of Asia, the western tip of Asia. But still, we make it a point to be a continent. Why? For many reasons. A certain cultural unity in its difference, even a certain physiognomical unity, a way of doing economy, common history, and much more. Something similar happens with North Africa. It is Africa, but at the same time, it is not Africa. It's perceived as a reality apart, with its own civilization, rules, values. So why is it? I mean, why this community around the Mediterranean is so different? It has such a strong identity. Well, there are many reasons, but one fundamental had been somehow the object of an intuition by the old philosopher Montesquieu, who taught about climate as a determinant of identity. We are probably what we are with our own identity, which is not justified by the existence of geographical barriers that separated us from the rest of the emerged lands, because we benefited of a quite special climate. And it was quite special throughout the whole history of mankind. We tend to consider the most important revolution that touched mankind the Industrial Revolution, because it is recent and somehow it is glittering. But if we take a step away and look objectively at our short history on planet Earth, we must acknowledge that another revolution was much more important. And it happened roughly 10, 11,000 years ago. It was the agricultural revolution. It was the moment in which mankind switched from being a passive user of the ecosystem, we were hunters, gatherers, to a role of manager of the ecosystem that later expanded. The socioeconomic organization that we still have today is an heritage of the agricultural revolution. We are still organized in urban areas to which rural areas cater. And the basis of our economies is still agricultural productivity, including the productivity of our seas. And the agricultural revolution, so fundamental in shaping the organization of mankind, started around the Mediterranean. Why here? It was not because a bunch of more evolved or clever sapiens were dwelling here. It is not because of their special capabilities. It is because here something happened that made it possible. And this something that happened in the moment in which planet Earth became more generous and more stable with the end of the last ice age is the presence of our quite unique sea. It's a huge mass of water, but it's not oceanic. So it exerts a certain stabilizing function towards climate. It makes it not only milder, because there is inertia between summer and winter, but it makes it also more stable and predictable. Now, let me make you some considerations about the dangers represented by climate change and environmental degradations. Scientists describe climate change in terms of temperature, and scientifically they are right. But maybe they forget to tell people that it is not a question of heat or cold. Japan has an average temperature which is almost 2 degrees higher than Italy, but this did not prevent Japan from developing. This extra heat is the measuring of something which is much more dangerous. It is a measure of chaos. The fact that our system intakes a huge quantity of solar energy without dissipating it back to space. NASA says the equivalent of the explosion of 400,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. This overintake of energy transforms into disorder. And this is the real danger posed by climate change. When media talk about the impacts of climate change, they single out 2 out of 3 of them, and they forget the most dangerous one. They talk about impacts on human physiology, for instance, with heat waves that kill elderly people, like it happened in 2004 in Europe, or with the expansion of the areas in which epidemics are dwelling. So we have, for instance, the appearance of the Nile fever in the United States. Then they talk about impacts on infrastructure, the famous damages caused by extreme weather events like hurricanes and things like that. But they forget to mention that climate change is making climate unpredictable. And climate, in turn, is the clockwork of nature. And when this clockwork becomes desynchronized with nature services, the ecosystem services, you have a complete destabilization of the natural system, which in turn causes the destabilizations of human societies. Just to make it clear, it is not by chance that animals have their puppies at the same time in which plants have their fruits. But if springtime becomes random and unpredictable, it arrives 2 months later than forecasted, it is not a reason that allows mother bear to have her puppy 2 months later. So this shifts, this desynchronization is already making the ecosystem suffer a lot. And in turn, we suffer also because with an unpredictable ecosystem, we cannot rely on its services, and we cannot organize our societies. How can you decide when to put seeds in the ground if you don't have an idea of when it will rain? But it is not only a rural problem. Also, the manager of water distribution in a big city needs to know when mountains will have snow or not, or if they will not have snow, to organize water distribution. So the big problem with climate change is that climate becomes randomized, unpredictable. The opposite happened around the Mediterranean with the end of the last ice age. Due to the new phase into which planet Earth entered, but in an especially strong way due to the presence of this closed mass of water in our region, climate was particularly predictable in our region, and with it, the timing of ecosystem services became particularly predictable, and this enabled starting the agricultural revolution right here in Anatolia, in the Fertile Crescent in Southern Europe, and together with the agricultural revolution, the beginning of many fundamental civilizations. So if you agree with me, once this mechanism is disrupted, what is at stake is not only the fact that we will have a series of difficult impacts to cope with, but what is at stake is the fundamentals of our identity and the main mechanism that describes and defines what are our interests. What is happening is that the Mediterranean is still there, but it's taking also as a sea a huge amount of energy. A recent research demonstrated that the Mediterranean waters are the fastest warming globally. In terms of atmospheric temperature, we are the second fastest warming region. And with this comes a certain disruption of a mechanism that we relied on for millennia. That is that the good weather used to be marked by the coming of the Azores anticyclone. But with the new energetic state of our planet, the Azores anticyclones is driven more and more away in favor of African anticyclones. This is not only weather or climate. This means that the fundamentals of our identity and interests are being subtly and not so subtly reshuffled. It means, if you agree with me, that climate is a determinant of identity and interest, that there is a breach taking place inside Europe, because a united Europe is starting to experience two different and diverging climate patterns, but there are also unifying trends between Europe and North Africa. It seems so abstract, but let me give you a couple examples. First, the Mediterranean is the second fastest warming region, but there is a region which is warming even faster, which is the Arctic. It comes with a lot of problems, but also with a couple, let us call them advantages. One of them is that some mythical maritime routes, which were difficult to navigate in the past, are now becoming practicable. I'm talking about the mythical Northwest Passage on top of Canada and Alaska, and of the also mythical Northeast Passage on top of Siberia. With this accelerated warming, these maritime routes are becoming practicable, and they are evaluated at $9 to $11 billion per year in terms of possible revenue that they can produce. So we are so happy that another friends, among so many problems, also could benefit of some advantage. But if these routes, and especially the Northeast Passage, become currently practicable, the consequence is the Suez Canal loses its value. For many of the maritime routes, it just doesn't make sense to pass through Suez if you can go on top of Siberia. It means that the ports of Athens or Naples suddenly become fishermen ports. No need to have big transport structures there, because transportation will happen somewhere else. So indeed, we have a dividing trend inside Europe. On the other hand, we have unifying trends between Europe and North Africa. And I'll give you another example about a sector that nobody really cares about in the general public: forestry, and together with forestry, agriculture. Well, in the sector of forestry, we've witnessed in the last 10, 12 years an increasing cooperation between the North and the South. And it was not an increasing cooperation which was fostered or encouraged by states. It happened spontaneously. Why? Because forest people, and by the way, forest people manage a huge amount of interest and money, although they're not really in the spotlight. But besides that, why is it? Because forest people are friends of the ecosystem, so they decided to cooperate? Maybe, of course, but there is another reason. And that is that crops and vegetable species which are viable now in the South can be the ones that save our agricultures in the North, and together with them, our economies. So the changing climate is not only a collection of forecasted difficult impacts. It means that the very foundation of Europe being at the center of the agricultural revolution, and nowadays the very foundation of our sets of interests, is at stake. And if these developments go unnoticed by policy, if they are not considered by policy, they can become a powerful driver for division and conflict. They could break the European Union, and in the reshuffling of resources, they could open many dangerous conflicts. But thanks God, we are here to remind policy that these things exist and that decisions have to be taken to take all this into account. And how can we give policy a good advice? Well, the answer is always the same. We have to rely on science. Physical science, hard sciences, quantitative sciences, but also economy, also social sciences. What do they tell us? This is happening in a region in which it is particularly dangerous, because besides impacts of climate change and besides this disrupting influence of a changing climate, this region is also already characterized by a dangerous asymmetry. It's a region of people who can and people who can't. And this is well portrayed by the figures in international commerce. Of all international commerce in the Mediterranean region, 90% happens between northern states, 9% between the north and the south, and only 0.9%, 1% between southern states. It tells a long story about who can and who can't. But it's only a superficial story, because together we all can a lot, but only together. And the point I want to come to, I will anticipate it, is that due to its space and its width, no one around the Mediterranean has enough resources to face climate change on its own. We need to put together our resources. We need to interconnect. We need to rely on each other. If we do this, climate change, which is a huge threat, paradoxically can become a moment for achieving what we have never really achieved in the Mediterranean, which is peace. Really, we need to put together. Let me give you some simple, basic examples. Here there is a fridge, a modern fridge, so useful. But we can't forget that the south rim of the Mediterranean has been accustomed to managing drought during thousands and thousands of years. So yes, we can contribute with the modern contemporary conception of refrigerating machines, but we cannot forget that more than 3,000 years ago, in the southern part of the Mediterranean, along the Silk Road, people started building those cone-shaped buildings, which are called yakchal. They were used to stock merchandise along the Silk Road, especially food merchandise, because inside these buildings there is constantly a temperature between 0 and -4, and it's obtained while outside it might be up to 50 and without the expenditure of one single watt of electricity. We might be concentrating on computerized management of irrigation, which is absolutely fundamental. But at the same time, somewhere else, they had developed a technology called the keynote, through which they could gather water in the desert. And through this, the Persians built gardens in the desert. We rely on air conditioning, and it is a problem, because the warmer it gets, the more you use air conditioning, but then the more you use energy, the more you have greenhouse effect, the more it gets warm. So it's a feedback loop. I don't say we have to give up air conditioning, but at the same time, we should remember that down south, thousands of years ago, they devised a system through which houses in very warm areas have an extremely pleasant temperature inside. They can even produce ice inside their houses in the basement. Through this system, you see those towers, they capture wind. This is a photo in the city of Yazd. To make a long story short, we need each other. We need interconnection, for instance, in energy, because the European Union, if we want to achieve carbon neutrality in certain sectors, we need renewables, but certain renewables are available only in the south. Sun to produce electricity, but also for splitting water and producing green hydrogen, without which it is virtually impossible for the European Union to achieve its goals. But we also need interconnection of systems, of electric systems in the south. Because once you start to rely on renewables, this is very good. But especially in a first stage, renewables are not enough. They depend so much on the availability of some power sources, which are not always there. Accumulation is not so advanced, so you need a backup from traditional grids. But if you take traditional grids and you segment them in national units, they're not enough to back up a transition towards renewable energies. So the south needs to unite, the north needs to unite with the south, the north needs to unite inside it, without which what lies before us is a huge threat of conflict and disruption. But if we take this opportunity, we observe what is happening. And through science, because this is not political, this is not ethical, it's science that is telling us nobody can face what's happening on its own. If we put together our resources, our knowledge, we can face it, and not only can face it, we will automatically build economies which are better distributed, fairer, with less poor and less rich people, where everybody participate, and in a balanced economic relationship are the roots, the root causes of something we have always looked for and never really achieved, which is the climate of peace over the Mediterranean. Thank you very much for your attention.
It's a very inspiring presentation, very useful, exactly what we needed to complement the kind of work that we've done so far. So the line is traced very clearly. How to achieve this is probably not so easy. I mean, so the reasoning is clear, but how can we convince 22 different governments to 22 around the Med, but maybe more, because the entire Europe should be involved, because the Med is a European basin in the sense that the entire Europe has an interest on this basin. So how can we practically achieve this and put this at the center of the agenda?
We are actually going quite quickly forward. There are some circumstances. One is raised awareness, and another one, paradoxically, is COVID, that showed so much how nobody can really solve something which is global on its own. But let me signal that we have two important upcoming moments in which ministers of 42 countries are expected to adopt decisions, declarations that go very much in the sense that I've tried to show. On the 21st of April in Portugal, there will be the UFM ministerial meeting on energy. And I can tell you, energy is a whole bunch of different segments, problems, interests, but we are not having any difficulty on focusing this declaration on the transition and on a common transition, a transition based on the contribution of everyone. Later on, between July and September in Egypt, we will have the UFM ministerial meeting on environment and climate change, and the music is the same. Of course, there are interests here and there that resist change because they are dwelling so fantastically in the situation as it is, but they too are starting to understand that sustainability is not a sacrifice. Sustainability is an advantage for competitivity. To put it in words that I've heard 1 week ago in a call with the International Energy Agency, the moment is magical, because before we were acting against the market. Now we are acting with the market backing us, not only because market actors are aware of the dangers, but also because they realize that being sustainable makes business more profitable and more stable. So yes, you're right, it's difficult, but I am optimistic. Things are going very, very fast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And with this optimistic attitude, I give the floor to Margherita Cappelletto for the rest of the day. Thank you again.